The acrid smell of antiseptic and quiet desperation clung to the trauma unit at Roosevelt General. It was a scent Anya Sharma had come to know intimately, a sterile perfume that failed to mask the raw human fear underneath. She moved with practiced efficiency, a ghost in blue scrubs, her hands sure as she checked IV lines and updated patient charts. She was a good nurse, competent, reliable, unremarkable. That was the entire point. "Sharma!" The voice cut through the low hum of the unit like a scalpel. Dr. Marcus Vance, chief of trauma surgery, stood over a gurney in Bay 2, his face a mask of regal impatience. He was a man carved from academic arrogance and starched white coats, a surgeon whose reputation was matched only by his ego. "Coming, Dr. Vance." Anya glided to his side. The patient was a mess from a motorcycle accident. Open femur fracture, probable internal bleeding. Vance was barking orders, a conductor orchestrating a familiar, chaotic symphony. Lactated ringers wide open. "Get me a baseline CBC and type and cross for 4 units. Page Orthopedics. Let's get him scanned." Anya's eyes swept over the patient. A rapid, almost subconscious assessment. The distended abdomen, the bruising pattern, a classic seatbelt sign even without a car. But something else was off. A subtle mottling of the skin on his lower back, a slight asymmetry in his chest expansion. "Doctor," she said, her voice low, intended for him alone. "His breath sounds are a little diminished on the left. Maybe we should consider a chest tube before CT." Vance paused, a pair of trauma shears in his hand. He looked down at her, not with consideration, but with the weary condescension of a king addressing a stable hand. "Nurse Sharma," he said, drawing out her name as if it tasted foul. "Are you now an attending physician? Did I miss your graduation from medical school? Or are you just reading pamphlets in your spare time?" A few of the junior residents snickered. Anya felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger she had learned to expertly suppress. She clenched her jaw. "No, doctor, it's just an observation." "Then stick to observing the monitors and fetching my supplies," he snapped, turning back to the patient. "Your job is to follow my orders, not to offer a differential diagnosis. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, doctor." She stepped back, her face a neutral mask, but inside, a bitter monologue unspooled. 3 years. 3 years of this. Of fetching and carrying and biting my tongue until it bled. Of watching men like Vance practice medicine like it was a checklist, a rigid set of rules that left no room for the beautiful, terrifying improvisation that real trauma demanded. This hospital, with its gleaming floors and rigid protocols, was her penance. Her sanctuary, her prison. It was the safest, most suffocating place on earth. She had chosen it for that very reason. Unremarkable was safe, competent was invisible, and invisibility was the only thing that had kept her alive. She remembered a different kind of chaos, dust and sand, and the percussive thump-thump-thump of inbound helicopters, the smell of jet fuel and blood. A world away from Roosevelt General, she had practiced a different kind of medicine, a savage, desperate art form conducted in tents and shaking fuselages, with whatever tools were at hand. There, she hadn't been Nurse Anya Sharma. There, she had been a god. Anya finished her tasks, her movements fluid and economical. She ignored the lingering smirks from the residents. She ignored the smug set of Vance's shoulders. She focused on the rhythm of the machines, the steady beep and whir that meant life was, for the moment, winning. She was just a nurse. She repeated the words to herself, a mantra of self-effacement. She was just a nurse. But as she hung another bag of saline, her hands, steady and sure, remembered the weight of a giggly saw. They remembered the delicate, horrifying feeling of holding a human heart in her palm, her finger plugging a hole that gushed life onto the desert floor. Her body remembered what her mind was trying so desperately to forget. Vance eventually stabilized the patient and sent him to the OR. The brief flurry of activity subsided, leaving the unit in its usual state of tense calm. Anya was restocking a supply cart when the red phone chirped, the direct line from Emergency Medical Services dispatch. A junior resident, Dr. Mills, answered it. His face went pale. Dr. Vance," he stammered, holding the receiver out. It's a big one." Vance took the phone, his professional arrogance snapping back into place. Anya kept working, her back to them, but her ears were tuned to the conversation. "Vance," he confirmed. "Yes." "How many?" "Understood." "What kind of transport?" Military transport?" Anya's hand stilled. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pricked at the base of her skull. "ETA 5 minutes, Vance announced to the room, his voice tight. "Mass casualty incident. A military transport truck involved in a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate. They're reporting at least 10 critical. All hands on deck. This is not a drill." The unit exploded into motion. It was the organized chaos she recognized, but a pale imitation of the real thing. Here, there were enough supplies, enough people. Here, the lights always stayed on. Anya moved with the rest of them, her training kicking in. But her mind was miles away, picturing shredded green uniforms and the specific, devastating injuries that high-velocity collisions inflicted on military-grade vehicles. The first wave of ambulances arrived, their sirens a rising, frantic scream that culminated in a sudden, jarring silence. The bay doors hissed open, and the carnage began to spill into her carefully constructed new world. Broken bodies on backboards, cries of pain, the frantic shouts of paramedics. Vance stood at the entrance, playing traffic cop, directing patients to the trauma base. Bay 1 for the critical head injury. Bay 3 for the crush injury. "Sharma, Miller, get in here." Anya worked. She was a blur of motion, a study in pure, unadulterated competence. She started lines, applied pressure to wounds, and triaged with an efficiency that began to draw stares. She wasn't just following orders anymore, she was anticipating them. She saw a tension pneumothorax before the medic had even finished his report, grabbing a decompression needle before Vance could even ask for it. He gave her a sharp, curious look, but was too overwhelmed to comment. Then, the last ambulance backed in. The medics who emerged were grim-faced, their uniforms stained. "This one's the worst of it," one of them yelled. "He was in the transport. GCS of 6. Multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen. Profound hypotension. We've pushed 4 units of ONEG already and can't get a pressure." They wheeled him in. He was a ruin of a man, his uniform torn to bloody ribbons, his body a canvas of catastrophic injury. He was intubated, a tube breathing for him, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Anya turned to help, and then she stopped. Everything stopped. The noise of the ER faded into a dull roar. The frantic motion around her seemed to slow, like a film grinding to a halt. She knew him. Beneath the blood and the tubes and the wreckage of flesh, she knew the hard line of that jaw. She knew the tribal tattoo that snaked up his neck, partially visible through the grime. Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson "Jax" Riley. A man she had once pulled from the rubble of a collapsed building in Kandahar, his leg nearly severed, his chest filled with concrete dust. A man who had looked at her with absolute trust as she performed a field amputation with a combat knife and a prayer. A man who was supposed to be stateside, safe, training recruits in Coronado. A man who was not supposed to be here, dying on a gurney in her civilian hell. For a full 3 seconds, she was no longer Anya Sharma, nurse. She was back in the dust, the scent of cordite in her nostrils, the weight of a dozen lives on her shoulders. She was Dr. Eris Thorne, and one of her men was dying. The spell broke. The sounds of the trauma bay rushed back in. "Into Bay 1, Vance commanded, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "Let's go, people! Move!" They swarmed around Jax, a flurry of hands and equipment. Vance took his position at the head of the bed, the unquestioned leader. "He's in V-Touch! Get the paddles! Massive transfusion protocol now! I want O-neg pouring into him! Somebody get me bilateral chest tube trays! We need to get him to the OR 5 minutes ago!" Anya moved, but her mind was racing faster than her feet. Her eyes weren't seeing the chaos. They were seeing the pattern, the wounds. They weren't from the crash. They were too small, too regular. Penetrating, not blunt force. Shrapnel. It was an IED pattern, but it was wrong, too tightly clustered. Almost surgical in its lethality. This wasn't a roadside bomb. This was a directed charge, an assassination attempt. Vance was focused on the abdomen, on the obvious signs of internal bleeding. It was the right call, the standard protocol. You find the biggest bleed, and you plug it. Exploratory laparotomy was the textbook answer, but the textbook was wrong. Anya saw the subtle distension of the veins in Jax's neck, the muffled quality of his heart sounds, even through the din. She saw the paradox of a man with a chest full of holes who wasn't presenting with a massive hemothorax. The blood wasn't filling his chest cavity. It was filling the sac around his heart. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the noise. He ignored her. "Charge to 200. Clear." Jax's body jumped on the gurney. The erratic rhythm on the monitor blipped, then returned. "He's not responding," Vance growled. "Damn it. Prep the OR. We're going up." "Doctor." Anya's voice was louder now, harder. It held an authority that made several of the other nurses turn to look at her. "It's not his abdomen. The primary injury is cardiac." Vance finally turned to her, his face thunderous. "I told you once already, Sharma. Get out of my way. You're going to chase a bleed in his belly while he dies from cardiac tamponade," she stated, her voice flat and cold. "The shrapnel is in the pericardium. He's drowning in his own blood, and it's strangling his heart. A laparotomy will kill him." A wave of shocked silence rippled through the bay. A nurse challenging the chief of surgery during a critical resuscitation was unheard of. It was professional suicide. Vance's face contorted with rage. He took a step toward her, his finger jabbing at her face. "You are relieved of duty, Nurse Sharma. Security will escort you from this unit. I will have your license for this. Get out of my trauma bay. Now." He turned to a resident. "Call security." Anya stood her ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression was carved from ice. She had faced down men with guns. Marcus Vance and his fragile ego were nothing. As the resident reached for the phone, a low, rasping sound came from the gurney. A single word, choked with blood and pain. "Doc?" Jax's eyes were open, just slits. But they were focused. They were locked on her. He didn't see a nurse in blue scrubs. He saw a dusty, blood-caked surgeon in combat fatigues. He saw the woman who had saved his life before. Every person in the room froze. Dr. Vance's hand, pointing at the door, dropped to his side. His head swiveled from Jax to Anya, his expression a cocktail of confusion and dawning horror. "Doc, is that you?" Jax whispered. And then the monitor screamed. A long, solid, terrifying tone. Ventricular fibrillation. Cardiac arrest. "He's coding!" someone yelled. Vance was paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene. The nurse he'd just fired, the dying soldier who called her Doc, the machine that was now singing a death song. Anya moved. There was no more hesitation, no more hiding. Anya Sharma, the quiet nurse, evaporated. In her place stood a force of nature. She vaulted over a supply cart, grabbing a 16-gauge needle and a 60 cubic centimeter syringe from a tray. He needs a pericardiocentesis, now, or he dies in the next 60 seconds. Vance finally snapped out of his stupor. Without ultrasound guidance, that's insane. You could puncture his ventricle. Anya looked him dead in the eye. The quiet nurse was gone. This was a commander on a battlefield. Her voice was low, lethal. I am the guidance. She didn't wait for permission. She plunged the needle into Jax's chest, just below the xiphoid process, aiming for his left shoulder. It was a blind stick, a move of such breathtaking arrogance and skill that the entire room held its breath. She pulled back on the plunger. Dark, non-clotting blood filled the syringe. The classic sign. The monitor flickered. The deadly tone broke, replaced by a weak, thready rhythm. She had bought him minutes, maybe less. He's still bleeding into the sack, she announced, her voice ringing with absolute authority. It's not enough. Get me a thoracotomy tray. And a giggly saw. Now. The nurses and residents looked to Vance, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion. He was still their chief. Vance stared at the syringe full of blood, at the resurrected heartbeat on the monitor, and then at the woman who stood before him. She was no longer a nurse. He didn't know what she was, but she was their only hope. He gave a single, jerky nod. It was all the permission the team needed. They scattered, grabbing supplies with a new, desperate urgency. We are not doing a thoracotomy in the ER, Vance protested weakly, a final gasp of his shattered authority. The OR is prepped. It's sterile. The OR is 5 minutes away, Anya shot back without looking at him. He has one. Scalpel. A handle was slapped into her palm. We're doing a clamshell, she declared. I need access to the entire mediastinum. A resident paled. A clamshell? Here? That's butchery. No, Anya said, as she made a long, sweeping incision from under one armpit, across the sternum to the other. Butchery is letting a soldier die because you're afraid to get your hands dirty. She took the trauma shears and began cutting through ribs, the cracking of bone, a sickening percussion in the suddenly silent room. She worked with a speed that was inhuman. It wasn't the careful, methodical pace of a civilian surgeon. It was a frantic, brutally efficient ballet of motion honed in the crucible of war, where the only thing that mattered was the seconds on the clock. Get the rib spreaders in here, she commanded. Crank them open. I want to see his heart. They followed her orders without question. Vance, the chief of surgery, was now functioning as her assistant, suctioning blood, his hand shaking slightly. With a final, terrible crack, the chest opened like a book. The sight was horrific. The pericardial sac, the fibrous bag around the heart, was swollen and purple, tight as a drum. Jax's heart was struggling against the pressure, beating weakly, unable to fill. Scissors, she incised the pericardium. A geyser of dark, pent-up blood erupted, splashing onto her face and arms. The heart, suddenly free, leaped in his chest, and the rhythm on the monitor strengthened, the pressure jumping 20 points. A collective gasp went through the room. There, she said, her fingers probing the surface of the now visible heart. There it is. She found it. A tiny, wicked piece of metal, no bigger than a fingernail, embedded in the wall of the right ventricle. It was pulsing with the heartbeat, a miniature geyser of bright red blood spurting with every contraction. She didn't hesitate. She pressed her finger over the hole. The bleeding stopped. 3-0 proline suture on a cardiovascular needle, she ordered, her voice eerily calm. And somebody get ready to cross-clamp his aorta if I tell you to. I need you to be my hands, Dr. Vance. Suction right here. Keep the field clear for me. Vance, his face a mask of awe and disbelief, did exactly as he was told. He was a student again, watching a master at work. She threw the first stitch, a pledge stitch, buttressed with Teflon, felt she had someone grab from the cardiac cart. She worked with a fluid grace, her hands moving as if they had their own separate intelligence. She placed 3 more, her finger never leaving the hole, her movements economical and precise. She was talking as she worked, not to herself, but to them. Teaching them. In the field, we call this damage control surgery. You don't fix everything. You just stop the dying. You plug the holes, you stop the bleeding, and you get them to the next level of care. But right now, we are the next level of care. She pulled the final suture tight. The bleeding stopped completely. The heart beat strongly, rhythmically beneath her fingers. She held her hand there for a moment, feeling the life she had just wrestled back from the brink. "He's stable," she said, her voice dropping, the adrenaline beginning to recede. "Blood pressure is 110/70 and climbing. Heart rate is 90. The room was filled with a profound, reverent silence. They had just witnessed a miracle, a brutal, bloody, and undeniably miraculous procedure performed in an ER bay by a woman they thought was a nurse. Anya, or Aris, took a step back, her arms covered in Jax's blood. She looked at the monitors, confirming what her hands already knew. He was alive. He would live. She felt a wave of dizziness as the exhaustion hit her, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that 3 years of quiet shifts had almost made her forget. Dr. Marcus Vance slowly straightened up from the gurney. He stripped off his bloody gloves and stared at her, his eyes wide with 1,000 questions. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling awe. He cleared his throat. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She met his gaze, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't look away. She didn't hide. "I'm Dr. Eris Thorne," she said, the name feeling both foreign and profoundly right on her tongue. "Formerly of the Joint Special Operations Command." Vance just stared, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The magnitude of what he had just seen, of who he had been speaking to, settled over him. I'm sorry, doctor," he said, and the apology was so sincere it was almost painful. "You were right. I was wrong." What would you have done in Dr. Vance's position? Confronted with undeniable proof that your ego almost cost a life, could you admit your mistake so completely? Share your thoughts in the comments. Later, after Jax was packaged and moved to the surgical ICU, a stable but critical patient, the hospital began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The other crash victims were treated, the chaos subsided. But for the staff of the trauma unit, the world had tilted on its axis. They spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at the woman in the blood-spattered scrubs who was quietly cleaning her station, her movements once again calm and unassuming. But now they saw her differently. They saw the steel beneath the quiet exterior. Vance found her in a deserted on-call room. She was sitting on the edge of a cot, staring at her hands, which were now scrubbed clean, but still felt stained. "Dr. Thorne," he began, testing the name. He walked in and shut the door behind him. "JSOC. That's Tier 1. The best of the best. They call the surgeons who work with them ghosts because they barely exist on paper." He paused, searching for the right words. "The procedure you performed, the clamshell in the ER, I've only read about it in case studies from battlefield hospitals. It's legendary. It's also considered almost universally fatal in a civilian setting." She didn't look at him. "It's only fatal if you fail." "Why?" he asked, the question blunt. "Why are you here, working as a nurse, a surgeon with your skills? You could run any trauma center in the country, in the world." I didn't want to answer him. The question was a key, and I had spent 3 years building a lock around the door it opened. Answering meant unlocking the room where I kept my failures, my ghosts. The name Thorne was a uniform I had taken off, convinced it was covered in blood I could never wash away. Sharma was meant to be a new skin, a life without the weight of command, without the burden of life and death decisions. I had failed. I had run from the battlefield, only to find it had followed me home. I burned out, I said, offering him the sanitized, palatable version of the truth. The version I had told myself so many times, I almost believed it. I was in charge of a forward surgical team. We had a mass casualty event. A mission went bad. I made some calls. They were the wrong ones. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. People died. Good people. Soldiers who trusted me. After that, I couldn't hold a scalpel without seeing their faces. So I quit. I walked away from all of it. I thought if I was just a nurse, if I just followed orders, I couldn't hurt anyone again. Vance was silent for a long time, processing this. He saw the pain in my eyes, the deep, settled trauma of a soldier who had seen too much. "The calls you made today saved a man's life," he said softly. "The calls I would have made. He'd be in the morgue right now. Whatever happened back there, Eris, you're not a killer. You're a surgeon. It's what you are." Before I could respond, a nurse knocked tentatively on the door. "Dr. Vance? And Dr. Thorne? Master Chief Riley is awake in the SICU. He's asking for you, Dr. Thorne. By name." My heart seized. Jax was awake, and he knew the real story. I found him in the hushed, cold environment of the surgical ICU. He was still intubated, but his eyes were clear. He tracked me as I approached his bed. A slate and a marker were on his bedside table. He gestured for it weakly. I gave it to him. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "They told me you were dead." I pulled a chair close, my throat tight. The official report said I was unaccounted for. It was easier to let people believe it. He shook his head, his eyes intense. He wrote again. "Raptor's Nest." It was a setup, Doc. The name hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Raptor's Nest. The operation that had broken me. A clandestine raid on a high-value target's mountain fortress. We had walked into a meat grinder. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The enemy was waiting, armed to the teeth. My team, a small, 4-person surgical unit, was overwhelmed by more than a dozen critical casualties in the first 10 minutes. I had worked for 16 straight hours in a collapsed bunker, performing impossible surgeries by the light of a single headlamp. I lost 4 men on my table. The official after-action report, which I never saw, blamed my unorthodox and high-risk procedures. It painted me as a reckless cowboy whose hubris had cost lives. The shame had been a shroud I'd worn ever since. Jax grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He scrawled furiously on the slate. "Intel was bad. Extraction was delayed on purpose. Someone wanted us wiped out. It wasn't your fault. You saved 8 of us. No one else could have done that." The words swam before my eyes. A setup? Betrayal? For 3 years, I had carried the weight of failure, believing my hands were stained with the blood of my men. The thought that it wasn't my fault, that I had been a pawn in some larger, more sinister game, it was disorienting, terrifying, and in a strange way, liberating. The foundation of my guilt, the bedrock of my exile, crumbled into dust. I was still trying to process this tectonic shift in my reality when a hospital administrator, a portly man named Henderson, appeared at the door of the ICU room. He looked flustered, his tie askew. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He was holding a tablet, his face pale. We had to process your biometrics for the emergency surgical clearance you were granted. Your fingerprints, they flagged a national security database." A cold dread washed over me, eclipsing the revelation from Jack's. I had been so careful. New name, new social security number, a background fabricated by a man I once knew who specialized in making people disappear. But fingerprints? You can't fabricate fingerprints. There are. Some gentlemen here to see you, Henderson stammered. They're from the Department of Defense. They're not the kind of people who take no for an answer. They had found me. The ghost was no longer a ghost. The gentlemen were waiting in a sterile, windowless conference room. Or rather, one gentleman was. The other two, built like refrigerators in ill-fitting suits, stood guard outside the door. The man inside was the opposite of his brutish sentinels. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair immaculately styled. He looked more like a Fortune 500 CEO than a government spook, but I knew his kind. The real power never wore a uniform. He rose as I entered, a thin, predatory smile on his face. Dr. Vance was with me. He had refused to leave my side, a silent, stubborn guardian. Dr. Eris Thorne, the man said, his voice smooth as polished marble. A ghost, indeed. It's a pleasure to finally meet the legend in person. I am Director Croft. I knew the name, Deputy Director of a clandestine branch of the DOD, so secret it was barely a rumor. He was the one who had signed the after-action report on Raptor's nest, the man who had ruined my life. You have a strange way of showing your pleasure, Director, I said, my voice flat. Last I heard, your office declared me incompetent and responsible for the deaths of 4 operators. Croft's smile didn't falter. A necessary fiction, Doctor. A piece of theater for a very specific audience. Please, sit. I remained standing. Vance stood beside me, a solid, unmovable presence. Raptor's nest was a disaster, Croft continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. But not in the way you think. We had a mole, very high up in the command chain, feeding intel to our enemies. The mission was designed to fail. It was bait. Your heroic, and I do mean heroic, efforts to save those men were an unexpected complication. Your subsequent disgrace and disappearance were, however, a gift. I stared at him, my mind reeling. A gift? You destroyed my career, my life. We gave you the perfect cover, he corrected. No one looks for a disgraced surgeon working as a nurse in a civilian hospital. You became a true ghost, and in the meantime, your failure caused the mole to become overconfident. He's made mistakes. We're getting close to him. My entire exile, my 3 years of self-flagellation, had been a lie, a tool. I wasn't a failure. I was a piece of cover. The anger that rose in me was cold and pure. What do you want, Croft? I want you back, he said simply. The mole is still active, and he's involved in something new. We've been authorized to create a new unit, a small, agile, rapid response surgical team. They'll operate outside the wire, in places conventional forces can't go. It's your kind of medicine, Doctor. Unconventional, improvisational, brilliant. We want you to build it. We want you to lead it. The offer hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. A return to the shadows. A return to the world that had used me, broken me, and then cast me aside as part of a grand, cynical strategy. But it was also a return to my purpose. A return to the only thing I was ever truly good at. Before I could formulate a response, Croft's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his smooth composure cracked for the first time. A flicker of genuine alarm crossed his face. Simultaneously, a series of sharp, electronic chimes echoed through the hospital, followed by an automated, dispassionate voice over the intercom. Code Silver. Code Silver. Hospital lockdown is in effect. This is not a drill. Code Silver. Active shooter. Vance and I exchanged a horrified look, Croft's face was grim. "It's him," he said, his voice low. "The mole. He knows I'm here. He knows you're here." My blood ran cold. This wasn't random. "Who is the target?" Vance demanded. Croft looked at me, his eyes like chips of ice. "There are only 2 living witnesses who can definitively place the mole at the scene of the betrayal that preceded Raptor's nest. One of them is Master Chief Jackson Riley. The other one is you, Doctor." The hospital, my sanctuary, had just become a hunting ground, and we were the prey. The assassins were professionals. They didn't storm the hospital with guns blazing. They were already inside. A man who had checked in with fake chest pains. A woman disguised as a visitor. They moved with quiet, deadly intent toward the surgical ICU. My mind, trained for this exact kind of scenario, kicked into a gear I hadn't used in years. The hospital wasn't a building. It was a tactical environment. The long corridors were firing lanes. The supply closets were hiding places. The staff and patients were non-combatants to be protected. "Croft, get your men to lock down the ICU wing," I ordered, my voice snapping with the authority of my old life. "Vance, get on the hospital-wide system. I want every floor sealed. Elevators shut down. Keycard access only. Use the fire doors. Create choke points." Both men, a spy master and a chief surgeon, looked at me and nodded, immediately following my lead. I was no longer a doctor or a nurse. I was a combat commander again. "They'll come for Jax first," I said, thinking aloud. "He's the soft target. I'm going to him." I ran, Vance at my heels. The hospital was in controlled panic, staff ushering patients into rooms, doors slamming shut. We reached the ICU just as Croft's men were establishing a perimeter. Inside, I found Jax. His eyes were wide with fear, the monitors beside him starting to show his distress. He knew, on some primal level, he knew the wolves were at the door. A nurse I didn't recognize was at his bedside, checking his IV line. She looked up as I entered, her smile a little too tight, a little too bright. "Everything is fine, Doctor," she said, just giving him a little something to calm his nerves. I saw the syringe in her hand. It wasn't saline. It was milky white. Propofol. A massive, lethal dose. "Get away from him," I said, my voice a low growl. The nurse's smile vanished. Her eyes went flat and hard. In a single, fluid motion, she dropped the syringe, and a small, suppressed pistol appeared in her hand. Before she could level it at Jax, I moved. I didn't have a weapon, but the room was full of them. I grabbed a heavy, stainless steel instrument tray and swung it like a shield, deflecting her arm as she fired. The shot went wide, burying itself in the wall with a dull thwack. She was fast, but I was faster. I brought the edge of the tray down hard on her wrist. I heard a snap, and she cried out, the gun clattering to the floor. I kicked it under the bed. The fight wasn't over. She lunged at me, her other hand coming up. A scalpel she must have palmed from a nearby cart glinting in the fluorescent light. I sidestepped, using her momentum against her, and slammed her into the wall. Just then, the doors burst open. It wasn't hospital security. It was a full squad of Navy SEALs in tactical gear, weapons raised. They fanned out, securing the room with terrifying efficiency. The lead operator saw me struggling with the assassin. He leveled his rifle, but then his eyes widened in recognition behind his combat goggles. "Doc?" he shouted in disbelief. "Holy hell, Doc Thorne!" 2 of his men grabbed the struggling assassin, subduing her with zip ties. The lead SEAL, a man I recognized as Lieutenant Commander Price, lowered his weapon. "Director Croft made the call," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Said you might need an assist. Good to see you, ma'am. It's been too long." The immediate threat was over. The mole's cleanup crew had been neutralized, but the standoff had just begun. In the aftermath, the hospital was a whirlwind of federal agents, bewildered police, and stunned hospital staff. The mole's network was unraveling, thanks to the intel recovered from the captured assassins. Croft found me in the same conference room hours later. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion in its place. "The President sends his personal thanks, Doctor," Croft said, his tone devoid of its earlier smoothness. He looked tired. He looked shaken. "You saved more than just a soldier's life today. You prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach." He slid a folder across the table. "The offer stands. The unit is yours to command. Name your terms. Name your price. We need you, Aris." The path was clear. I could step back into the shadows, back into the world of ghosts and whispers. It was a world I understood. It was a world where my skills were not just valued, but essential. But then Dr. Vance walked in. He looked as exhausted as I felt, but his eyes were clear, filled with a purpose I hadn't seen in him before. "She has a place here, Director," Vance said, his voice firm. He stood beside me, a surprising and welcome ally. "I've already spoken with the hospital board. They've approved my recommendation. We're creating a new department, the Thorne Center for Advanced Trauma and Veteran Care. It will be a place for research, for teaching, for treating the unique injuries our soldiers bring home. We're building it around her. She will be its chief." 2 paths, 2 futures. One led back into the darkness I had just escaped. The other offered a way to bring the lessons of that darkness into the light. I looked from Croft's calculating gaze to Vance's earnest, respectful one. I thought of Jax, resting safely in his room, guarded by men who called me Doc. I thought of the residents and nurses who had watched me work, their eyes wide with a new understanding of what was possible. For 3 years, I had been running from a ghost. My own. I believed it was a specter of failure, but Jax and Croft had shown me the truth. It was a ghost of betrayal. But a ghost is just a memory without a place to rest. Croft offered me the shadows I already knew, a world of perpetual twilight. Vance offered me a place to build a home for that memory, to turn the pain of the past into a purpose for the future. I made my choice. I turned to Director Croft. "My work is here now," I said, my voice steady. "These people need what I know. We're going to build something that honors the soldiers you send into the dark. We're going to be the light they come home to." I pushed the folder back across the table. "But if you have a soldier bleeding out somewhere no one else can reach, you have my number." A slow smile spread across Croft's face. It was a genuine one this time. "That's the best deal I was going to get, wasn't it?" "It's the only one you were," I replied. 6 months later, the Thorne Center was a reality. It was a state-of-the-art facility, a fusion of military efficiency and civilian innovation. My final scene isn't one of chaos, but of calm purpose. I stood in an observation theater, dressed in a crisp white coat with my name, Dr. Aris Thorne, Chief of Trauma, embroidered over the pocket. Below me, in a high-fidelity simulation lab, a team of residents, with Dr. Vance acting as senior attending, was practicing a clamshell thoracotomy on a hyper-realistic mannequin. I was teaching them. I was passing on the brutal, life-saving lessons of the battlefield. I was taking the ghosts of Raptor's Nest and turning their sacrifice into a legacy of life. I was no longer Anya the nurse, hiding from the world. I was no longer Aris the ghost, haunted by my past. I was Dr. Thorne, and I was finally home. She was a surgeon, a soldier, a ghost. Now she was a teacher, a builder, a leader, and she was just getting started.